Hi, I'm Eason, and I review stuff, and it is time for an album review. This time, the new release by the German stalwarts of technical brutal death metal, or rather brutal death metal with technical embellishments. The band that I'm talking about portray themselves as the only purveyors of quote-unquote Chernobyl death metal, and have the lyrics, subject matter, and cover art to actually back that up. The album I'm talking about is Cytotoxin's Nuklearth. Now, first things first, what do I mean by Chernobyl death metal? Is it just one more designation to add to the endless pile of subdivisions that the bands seem to come up with on the spot to describe their musical styles? Well, yes and kind of no. You see, Chernobyl death metal doesn't actually designate anything in terms of stylistic influences. It doesn't tell you anything about the band's music. Rather, it is meant to indicate the subject matter that they choose to dwell on in their lyrics. Cytotoxin separate themselves from their peers by refusing to talk about the more wholesome death metal themes such as violence or sex or sexual violence, gore, or monstrosities coming from the deep, or societal collapse, or any of that. Even though the allure of these more tried and true topics doesn't seem to be entirely lost on the band, from their 2011 debut Plutonium Heaven onward, Cytotoxin has chosen to dwell primarily on the effects of radiation and radiation poisoning on humans, on the environment, on society, and so forth. And the jump-off point they have chosen is the Chernobyl disaster. Now, lyrical content aside though, what does Cytotoxin actually sound like? Well, if I was to take Nuklearth as a sort of microcosm of the band's overall sound over the years, I would say that they sound a very highly technically skilled but still indulgent in brutality type of brutal death metal band. Nuklearth, not being an exception to the rest of their discography, of course, is chock full of really heavy chugs, fast-paced angular riffing, lots of shredding that travels up and down the fretboard as they please, lots of fretboard wizardry and technical noodling, married to really sharp, really angry, and at times really fucking thick bass and exceptionally skilled drumming. All of that laid under somewhat gurgly, really low register death growls. Right here, Steven Stockberger, the band's drummer since the 2017 release Gamageddon, gets special mention because of his highly intuitive and embellishment-heavy drumming style. Even though he manages to keep up with the brutality requirements of the music with lots of forceful blast beats and high-speed DBs, he really likes to throw in these little, sometimes extremely quick blink-and-you'll-miss-it cymbal embellishments. He really likes his tom attacks to the point where there are certain moments on this album where he leads primarily by tom attacks, and he manages to give the music a very solid rhythmic foundation. Now, I for one am extremely fond of drummers who just throw in these little improvised passages where they could otherwise just play it straight, so hats off to you, Mr. Stockberger. This drumming style also complements the rest of the instrumentation. Cytotoxin has always run the gamut of death metal styles, from slam-heavy chugs to more technical chromatic shredding to death grooves to churning, somewhat death black adjacent stylings. They have always kept their music dynamic, and Nuklearth is no exception to that. In terms of songwriting and every aspect of songwriting, the riffs, the song structures, the album structure itself, I think Nuklearth can best be summarized, at least from a structural standpoint, as being a modular album. In terms of song structures, this modular property exemplified in the fact that every single song on Nuklearth has one or two central points, central riffs or passages. These passages serve as anchor points for the tracks. The tracks either evolve from these parts or evolve towards these parts. And these parts, these passages, are used sparingly. They are used either flat out at the beginning or as breakout moments that make make an appearance later in the track. In fact, come to think of it, apart from Lupus Aurora, The Indomitable Coast of Lies, and Drown in Havoc, these central passages are used rather sparingly. And what I mean by this still might be a little abstract, but I'm going to go into the track list now to explain this a little better. And the first track, O'Toole, manages to exemplify what I mean by this quite sublimely. O'Toole actually starts out as a more death metal track than a brutal death metal track, with a very nice death groove to set things off. The band then move on to slam adjacent territories with a nice upper mid-tempo chug before throwing caution to the wind and introducing their trademark more technical sound with lots of shredding. But at the end of the more technical muscle flexing, they return to the slam adjacent chugging at the beginning. But when they do, they don't just repeat that and be done with it. When they repeat this section a second time after repeating it as is, they shift the time signature from an even one to an odd one, and the shift in tempo makes for a very tasteful transition. Another thing that Cytotoxin does on Nuklearth to keep things interesting is not just traveling across the whole spectrum of death metal styles, but having tracks lean more heavily towards one style or the other, or rather having some tracks lean a little more heavily to the burlier, more down-tuned, more angry and more primitive side of death metal than technical flourishes. Two tracks that exemplify this type of stylistic focus perhaps a little more overtly than the other songs on Nuklearth's track list would be Uran Breath and Soul Harvester, both of which fall within the realms of more heavy-set, muscle-bound, burlier and bulkier death metal. Both of these songs make heavy use of slam death adjacent riff stylings and are somewhat hesitant to indulge in the technical bravado that the other tracks on this album sport. This, while separating them from the rest of the track list, also exposes a little bit of a structural weakness within the album itself. When you have a track list full of dynamic, explosive, extremely wonderful tracks that keep things nice and varied, that travel across different styles and throw in lots of technical flourishes and embellishments like Dominus or Lupus Aurora or Coast of Lies or Quarantine Fortress, more straightforward, or at least somewhat straightforward tracks like Uran Breath and Soul Harvester kind of weigh the proceedings down. Don't get me wrong, these tracks are still very good, but they also mark dipping points within the excitement levels of the album and rob the album of some of the momentum that it has been building until they hit. It doesn't help that Soul Harvester is actually sandwiched between what is arguably the two best tracks on the album, which are Drown in Havoc and Coast of Lies, and given that these two tracks stand out far more than anything that is on offer on Soul Harvester, the track list does falter a bit and the album flow does suffer. One Hail Mary for Nuklearth in this instance, however, is that Cytotoxin did not actually stack these tracks against one another. If they had done that, the energy levels of the album, I predict, would be lowered significantly and the track list and the album flow would be affected so much more. So kudos, guys. However, even though Uran Breath serves as more of a ball on chain, like I just said, it also manages to exemplify a strength in songwriting that Cytotoxin has. You see, beyond just moving through different styles, Cytotoxin also managed to inject expansive, vast, and really immersive atmospheres that hit incredibly hard when they actually feel the need to do it. And Uran Breath, interestingly enough, features a very nice example of this. You see, even though the song proceeds more or less as how I described for the most part, when it hits a final bridge section, everything changes. Laid under a narration about the effects, long and short term, of radiation poisoning, the band takes the track to a very nice, very emotional, and somewhat quietly despairing place. Something that I wish they had done a little more to help this song along. That is a very minor and somewhat non-gripe that I actually have for the rest of the album, that I wish they had used the more atmospheric parts, such as some of the passages in Dominus, for instance, far more prominently. They actually do this on the track Coast of Lies, which is an expansive, extremely epic, really hard-hitting track, which, like I said, is one of the 2 top tracks on Nuklearth, but I think that is just a little too little, you know what I mean? Another weakness of Nuklearth is that it runs one track, exactly one single track too long. You see, the titular song, Nuklearth, should have been the closer. It is the perfect end to this album. It acts more or less as a summation of everything that has gone on until that point, and also makes more extensive use of the atmospheres that I have mentioned earlier. However, after Nuklearth ends, we still have one more track to go. And it's not that I don't get what they were trying to do with this closing instrumental. It was supposed to leave you with a sense of ominous foreboding. It was supposed to leave you with dread of what was to come, with the feeling that something has gone very, very wrong. And if this were a concept album, this would make a lot more sense. And from a storytelling standpoint, it still makes sense. It just doesn't make sense within the context of this record. Another element that is used rather sparsely, or used in a sparse manner in terms of style. Look, I'm not gonna mince words, guys. The vocals seem to have taken a hit between Gamageddon and now. Used to be that Grimo threw out different death metal vocal styles on track using a wide variety of vocalizations. You could hear death growls, you could hear screams, you could hear gurgles, you could hear pig squeals. You could hear pig squeals used in the way that some slam bands do as rhythmic instruments, and Nuklearth is largely devoid of that kind of variety. What you hear on this album in terms of vocals is going to be a guttural, low-register, gurgle-adjacent, and somewhat phlegm-drenched growl, and that is basically it. Since I actually really enjoyed his dynamic vocals in every other album that Cytotoxin has done, this to me is a bit of a negative. But balancing this out is the fact that the snare is far more of a ping-pong coffee can type snare this time around, and the mix and master is just a little bit, just a smidge more dynamic than the predecessor. I do really hope that Cytotoxin moves towards more and more dynamic mixes and masters, especially since, despite the fact that I really liked that album, Gamageddon could be a little much at times in terms of how tiring it can be on the ears. Something that seems to have changed and moved in the right direction during the course of Nuklearth. So I mean, if it wasn't obvious until now, I'm just going to flat out say it. I think Cytotoxin delivers yet once again one of the best albums of 2020. And I'm not entirely unbiased. Radiophobia was actually the album that sort of endeared the genre of brutal death metal for me and set the standard of what I have come to expect. So I'm not exactly a non-fan here. If you like death metal, if you like brutal death metal, if you like technical metal, technical death, or technical brutal death, or you know what, fuck it. If you just want hard-hitting, hard and fast, technically sound, skillfully written music that travels across different styles, features lots of dynamism, lots of variety, and does not bore at all and keeps things interesting throughout its length, Nuklearth is the album for you. As always, there's a Bandcamp link in the description. Why don't you click that, go listen and tell me what you think, or given that it has been some time since the album came out, because I'm a lazy bastard sometimes, if you have already listened to this, why don't you let me know how much you loved it or how much you didn't. If you like the content that I'm bringing you, please like, comment, and subscribe, as it helps a lot. And as always, it's Eason. Peace out.